So let's just do a quick sound check. Ricardo, can you hear us okay? Yeah, you can hear. Okay, good. We can't hear you. So we're going to start the meeting now, and I just want to start by maybe doing introductions here in person, here at the University of Washington. Representative Schmidt, do you want to kick us off today?
Sure. Representative Joe Schmidt, 9th District.
Cheryl Hutala from Arrow Blue Cross.
That's good to see you in person.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
Oh, Priscilla McGrath, University of Washington.
John Scott, University of Washington.
I'm Adam Romney. I'm an attorney at Davis Wright Maine.
Kathleen Damon with Swedish Medical Center. Emily Yu, multiple health system.
And I want to introduce Kent Unruh, who is our technician who's helping us out today. So if you have technical issues, Kent's going to help us out. Let's check in with folks on video. So Ricardo, if we can get a sound check on you.
Ricardo Jimenez, CMO, Seymour Community Health Centers.
Great, coming in loud and clear. Great to see you, Ricardo. And there's one other person on video. I'm sorry, I have my glasses on, so I can't really see who it is. Is that Leslie?
Hi, this is Leslie Emmerich. Yes, I'm representing the Washington State Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, ARMPs United of Washington, and the Home Care Association of Washington today.
Great, thanks Leslie. And then I'm looking at folks who are calling in. I see Sue Stern, who's representative. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Susan Stern. I'm representing the Washington State American College of Emergency Physicians. I'm an emergency physician at University of Washington.
Great to have you on today. Anyone else who's on the collaborative who wants to introduce themselves, either calling in or on video?
Lori Wakashige from Legacy Health in Oregon.
Hi, Lori.
Hi.
And I know we have a bunch of numbers here, so I can't tell who it is. So if you're on the collaborative, please introduce yourself. Okay, good. I know there's members of the public. We do have a time on our agenda for public comments, so that's at the end, and would ask you to introduce yourself either by video, phone, or in person here. We would ask that you hold them until that time. And I'm getting intelligence that Francis Guff is also on the line. Francis, are you there?
Well, I'm here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Francis. Well, good. Let's start by just reviewing the minutes from January 5th. This should have gone out. And this was down at Kaiser. Just wanted to thank Chris Cable again for hosting us. A very nice facilities you have there. This was a meeting, for those of you who aren't there, where we heard from Cindy LaRouge, who's a professor of health services research, to talk about some of the cost effectiveness studies that have been done telling us and how to think about it, and some of the data collection challenges in particular. We did formally submit the report to the legislature, and it is up on the website. There was some discussion about parity, and then we'll have a follow-up today on the net neutrality. Just wanted to see if there's any clarifications, edits that folks want to make before we move on. Seeing none, if I can get a motion to approve the minutes.
Please to approve.
Okay, a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone not in favor? Okay. We will get those up on the website and then next week or so. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is malpractice, and we're going to hear from Adam Romney. This is the general director. So what I can do is turn it over to you. Adam, here. Just give me a sec. someone to tell me which one it is. It's not saying that. This is not very checkable. Right, you can just put it on this. Another option I could do is I could put it Sorry, I think we might have an Apple PC talking issue here.
Could you stop?
I think I'm probably gonna beat you.
John, if you could stop sharing, yes, great.
Adam, is it this one right here? It says health insurance coverage.
Yeah, that should be it.
The only thing about that, Dr. Scott, is it's going to be in a PDF format.
Okay, I think we can scroll through it.
Okay.
Okay, right.
Great. So I've been asked to say a few words about malpractice coverage as it pertains to telemedicine. I should admit to you all that I'm not a malpractice attorney, but I consult with a lot of telehealth companies and clients, and that conversation often progresses into if they have adequate insurance and malpractice insurance and sources of liability, sources of malpractice liability. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about some of the things we often focus on. This is maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I getting the content of the slide?
So I think Kim, we're gonna probably have to go with your option here. I apologize, guys. Apple and PCs don't talk.
Can you just kind of keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So, just from a legal perspective, some of the very traditional sources of liability for physicians, malpractice liability. The first slide, if you have it, talks about just the elements of malpractice when you have a duty to treat a patient and your care falls below the standard of care to treat that patient.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Who defines standard of care? Is that an accepted term, or is there variation with that?
So what a court will do is they'll look at the practice in that specialty in that area. And that's a very relevant question for telehealth right now, because there's very little case law, very few decisions right now on telemedicine, alleging telemedicine malpractice. So it's very hard to say what that standard of care is for telehealth.
Does that come from the MQAC?
That's what, so if I was a judge and I was listening to a case about some malpractice action involving telehealth, I would draw from experts. I would ask, other physicians would testify in the court as to what is appropriate if that condition was appropriately treated via telehealth. I would look at things like the MQAC policy. The MQAC policy says, I'm going to paraphrase this, but you as a physician should only be engaging in telehealth for conditions that are appropriate to treat via telehealth. If that condition exceeds your capabilities to treat via telehealth, you shouldn't be doing it. But of course, that is an incredibly vague standard, so we don't really know where to draw that line. So they would be gathering information from experts, from associations, from other states, if other states have cases, to try and define that standard.
Thank you.
I'll just dwell on that a little more. I mean, that's a question I get a lot. What can we do through telehealth and what can't we do? And so far, we don't have a bright line for that. There aren't, the state medical boards don't go out there and say you can do these 35 things through telehealth, but the rest you can't. And so it's a tricky area to really know exactly what's appropriate to do. So that's the traditional source of malpractice liability if your treatment falls below that standard of care. If you don't get adequate consent for what you're doing via telehealth, that can be a source of malpractice liability. And if you exceed the scope of your license, you exceed the scope of your practice or your specialty, then that can also be a source of liability. So just an example of that exceeding your scope concept. If you are a primary care physician and you're relying on a peer-to-peer consult from, let's say, a psychiatrist, and you're really prescribing things or engaging in treatments that are outside of your scope, but you're relying on that consulting practitioner, if you can't ultimately take responsibility for what you're doing, you don't know what you're doing yourself, and you're relying too much on that expert, there's a potential for some liability there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So those are some traditional sources of professional liability. When we talk about telehealth, there are also some new sources of liability. I'll read this quote from an article that I came upon a few years ago. It says, "It is likely that malpractice lawyers will take advantage of emerging technologies as a new opportunity for litigation." And I'll tell just a little anecdote about that. Many of you are probably familiar with interoperative monitoring, where, for example, a patient's undergoing surgery and there is a neurologist observing brain activity through telehealth. Basically, the brain activity is transmitted to a screen in maybe a control center, and it is common practice for one neurologist to monitor several surgeries at a time. And when I mentioned this offhand at some firm lunch one day, one of the litigators in my firm started foaming at the mouth, thinking of how she would love to litigate that case. How could you really adequately look at six brains at a time? And this person wasn't a healthcare person. I don't know, but certainly an enterprising, opportunistic malpractice attorney can look at some of these technologies and say that the care may be inadequate if you're doing it in different locations through technology. So there's that risk. The next bullet here, will a telehealth standard of care emerge? That's kind of exactly what we were talking about. We don't really know what you can and can't do via telehealth yet until there have been more court cases or the medical boards come out and define it more specifically. For different modalities of telehealth, it becomes even more complicated. If you're engaging in at-home monitoring of telehealth, what's the responsibility of the practitioner who has asked the patient to submit data via monitoring? There's not a lot of involvement there. It's not a huge risk of harm either, but that's another area where there's not a lot of definition. And also, is there some liability if the technology fails? So for example, if you as a patient, let's say you take your loved one to a critical access hospital where there is telestroke, and You drive up to the hospital, wheel into the emergency room, and the technology fails. And if you would have known that that would have been unavailable, maybe you would have gone somewhere else. And there's some, again, an enterprising plaintiff's lawyer could maybe make a case out of that, that you relied on the availability of that telestroke. It wasn't available, therefore you want to sue for some damages. I feel like I'm starting this out on a very negative.
Right.
I don't know.
You had mentioned that what cases are you familiar with that have been?
There are so very few. So we do national searches, and there are radiology cases, and there are store and forward cases. But in terms of the direct-to-consumer, real-time, synchronous consultation things, I have not seen published cases. That doesn't mean they haven't happened, because so many times they're settled. And I have clients who have been sued for malpractice, but they settle before they get to court. And so it's certainly happening, but we just don't have published decisions yet. Yeah.
So the case that you described at a critical access hospital, I don't think is really relevant, because if you're going to that critical access hospital, there's not another choice.
Yeah. Well, I made
So I know that.
Yeah.
I think that there has to be some protection there when that hospital is making every effort, right, to take care of you. That was one. Second, Dr. Scott, does the National Association for Telemedicine, do they have some standard of care? Because it refers to it, this in that slide, will telehealth meet a standard of care? Are there some guidelines?
There are.
Because we talk about that.
Yeah. So the American Telemedicine Association, or ATA, does have general guidelines for patient to the providers. And then also we'll have specialty specific guidelines. For example, telestroke or telepsychiatry or teledermatology. And I think it would behoove everyone to know, first of all, the general guidelines, and then if you're doing any of those specialties, that you're in line with them. Yeah. And then, so that's ATA, but even within the specialties, they will also have specific telemedicine. I'm on the Infectious Disease Society of America guidelines for telemedicine I'm writing right now. There's a similar thing for the American College of Neurology, cardiology. All of our specialties are starting to carve out their own telemedicine specific guidelines.
And I'd add to that. Go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to pick on you. I'm just, but the reality, urban healthcare and rural healthcare are two different worlds.
I'll give you another example.
Okay.
Okay. So there is an Ivy League institution that says it provides telehealth consulting for cancer patients. Okay. And so they sell that as a consulting service to urban hospitals. And so maybe again, making this up, let's say that UW Medicine and Multicare both offer, they both have cancer centers. But let's say that UW has this consulting brand that they get this specialized consulting from Ivy League Institution X. You as a patient, you live in Federal Way, you have a choice between the two organizations. You decide to go to UW because they have this specialized consulting. Maybe you suffer some critical event on the way and the technology isn't there to access that specialist that you relied upon. And so, again, that's not the greatest example in the world, but you have choices as a consumer, and some institutions in urban and rural settings are promoting the fact that they have access to specialists through telehealth. And if they fail, especially in like that telestroke example where time is of the essence, maybe a plaintiff's attorney can come up with a case.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar just with one really egregious case of a doctor who was in Colorado, seeing a patient in California, and prescribed narcotics. So like multiple violations, interstate kind of no licensure, narcotics. So, you're starting to see the egregious things first, but it's going to start to whittle down into more of what we see more in everyday clinical medicine.
Yeah. And with regard to the standard of care, bedside care, being next to you giving care should mimic telemedicine care. So that's the standard of care upon which we base the telemedicine care. give the same, then you can't do it.
And our guidelines, the impact guidelines say that the care should be the same.
Right.
You should not be.
Right, so if you can't do that, if for whatever reason the technology is glitching in and out, you stop the telestroke consultation, you do it, whatever your backup is. That's all I'm gonna add.
Right. And on the question of associations, there are accrediting organizations. I don't think Joint Commission has done this yet, but URAC has done this where they are coming out with telehealth accreditation standards. So you could be a provider, go through their quality accreditation program, of course for a fee, and then be able to hold yourself out as an accredited telehealth provider in X specialty. And that doesn't define a standard of care by law, but it's a positive fact. If you're sued and you say, listen, we obeyed the higher law, we met the ATA standard for this specialty or your next standard. So it's an evolving world right now.
The ATA also offers that official stamp of certification as well.
And the DMD, as they're doing their comprehensive stroke center checks, are also asking more and more and more questions down the telestroke route.
Joint Commission as well.
So my next slide is selecting a carrier. And I will just say that as the standard of care is evolving, insurance carriers and their sophistication with regards to malpractice coverage for telehealth is also evolving. Many of them try to fit telehealth into existing language in their agreements for malpractice coverage, and it isn't always a great fit. And so my number one recommendation is to really have a sit-down conversation with your carrier and make sure they have a thoughtful, well-defined policy. Many policies allow the carrier to deny coverage if certain exceptions apply and if certain under certain kind of extreme situations. So for example, this second hyphen, a lot of policies say if we think you're engaging in unreasonably risky behavior, then that can be, we can decide not to cover an event or a claim. And you can imagine situations where they could try to fit telehealth within that exception. They also don't contemplate the concept of a multi-state telehealth practice. And a lot of health systems, a lot of provider groups, a lot of telehealth companies are of course trying to take advantage of the interstate compact and provide and broaden their footprint and provide services to patients in other states. And you have to look really closely at your policy to make sure that services to patients in other states are covered. Also, the policies often are not sufficiently comprehensive in terms of the telehealth modalities. They may cover a store and forward or a peer-to-peer consult type arrangement, but not direct patient care. And so again, it's important to really look at the scope of the coverage of the policy. Next slide. Okay, I've mentioned a few of these already, but ensure that the policy extends coverage to all states where the provider wants to provide services. Also a lot of telehealth companies are providing services for other providers. So for example, I think a lot of people here are familiar with Carina. The Carina providers furnish services under the name of other systems. And once that happens, is the policy broad enough to cover what they do under another entity's name and tax ID number? That can be a reason to kick a claim out of coverage. That's what that white label language means. There's also a lot of telehealth staffing companies where you need temporary staffing for a particular service, and you may have a temporary lease of a telehealth provider, and it can be tricky to get the right language to have that person covered under a malpractice policy. And there are very few carriers that are licensed in all 50 states, and so if you're traveling into a state where they're not licensed, that can also be an issue.
Adam, can you talk about the long arm statute? This is a law in Texas where apparently if you are a telemedicine provider and you come in to the state of Texas and you do something bad, they'll come after you or something like that. It's something unique to Texas. And it stood out in my mind because, you know, its reputation, the long arm of the law, yeah, they call it the long arm statute.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Just as a matter of civil procedure, if you treat a patient in Texas or in any state, civil procedure allows that patient to, you know, to sue you in Texas jurisdiction. Yeah. So a comment here about scope of coverage. Again, on this idea that the insurance carriers haven't really fully developed these policies, I would recommend really obtaining written assurances that the specific states and services and modalities that you're providing are covered. There's a scope issue with regards to state board of medicine investigations. So for someone who maybe is investigated for prescribing a substance that the state doesn't approve of, there can be a lot of expenses related to defending against those, and they're not always covered in a malpractice policy, so seeing if that can be included. This last one, explore the option of a separate service line or add-on policy. So if you're only doing interpretation services or store and forward services, it's possible to get a less expensive rider policy on your existing policy and just have it cover that modality that's viewed as less risky than direct patient care through telehealth.
Going back to the issue of jurisdiction, because most laws around telemedicine center around where the patient is it most likely that if a case were to come up, it would be the state where the patient is?
Yeah. And there are agreements. So if you, let's say pick on Teledoc, I guess. You know, when you sign the terms of use for Teledoc, there's very likely a venue clause in that contract that they actually happen to be from Texas. So they don't like Texas courts. So I don't know. They probably say in there that you as a patient agree to this, you know, Texas choice of law, and if you sue us, you have to sue us in Texas. So if you are receiving care and signing an agreement beforehand, you may already be agreeing to that. I feel like I'm going over time, but okay. So my last two slides, this is a topic that comes up more frequently than any other topic related to telehealth, and it's the concept of what type of liability is implicated by a peer-to-peer telehealth consult for the specialist. And traditionally, people have considered that to really not raise much liability for the specialist. You kind of do that drive-by consult. Your friend or your colleague calls you and says, "What do you think about this patient?" You give your opinion, and on you go. But so many telehealth service models are now really focused on peer-to-peer consults, or the informal consult, or the drive-by consult, whatever you want to call it, that is becoming more of an issue. And practitioners, I believe some are inappropriately expanding the scope of their practice by relying on what the specialists are telling them to do. And so recently there have been more claims and more complaints around this idea that, you know, this primary care doc inappropriately managed this specialized condition because he or she was relying on advice from a specialist. And so the last slide, I've just given some bullet points that we have communicated to many of our clients that talk about how to reduce that liability. And really what it comes down to is, if the patient is interacting with you as the specialist consulting physician, in many states, the physician-patient relationship is created, legally speaking, in the mind of the patient. So if that patient thinks that you are their doctor because you are on the other side of that screen, you are asking questions, you are making diagnosis recommendations, and the patient is aware of all that, there's a pretty good chance that you've created a relationship. And if that's the case, then there is a ground for liability against the consulting physician. So some of the things we recommend is that that specialist physician not actually examine the patient. And that they don't have direct communication with the patient. that they don't view the records. Now that one I know happens all the time, but again, if I'm an enterprising malpractice attorney, then I would point to that. If you as a consulting physician are being paid to be there to consult, some courts have said, you know, that's inconsistent with the idea of an informal drive-by consult if you have an obligation to do it. The physician consultant has provided the opinion advice solely to the treating physician. So that communication, again, really should be between physicians, not specialist consulting physician to the patient. And the last one is really the most important thing, is that the treating physician, the one in the presence of the patient or the one with the treatment relationship, maintains control of that care and the treatment decisions. So.
Is there a difference between this and someone seeking a second opinion?
Yeah.
So is second opinion considered not medical care and these types of things? I mean, even though they may be looking at medical records, they may be consulting directly with a patient or with the provider. Is there just something different about the category of providing an opinion on someone else's treatment plan that separates itself from this?
You know, a second opinion is a billable service, and a patient has to give informed consent to have a second opinion, an actual second opinion that's reflected in a CPT code. And so that does create a treatment relationship. And if there was negligence in that second opinion, it would be subject to, you know, potential liability. So I see a second opinion and a peer-to-peer consult as distinct.
Yeah, so the way I interpret that last slide or two, Adam, is the risk is really for like primary care doctors or maybe emergency doctors. So the Ricardo and Sue, this is relevant to you guys. And it's really the curbside, or for us, we call it MedCon, that you're probably more exposed than you think you are. And I think that telemedicine, we get more information with that. We are writing in the record. We are seeing the patient. So for the PCPs out there, we're really looking for some help immediately, and that's really what we're trying to do. Telemedicine is probably safer for them. They're more covered for those kind of relationships. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So are you thinking of I'm just mechanics, of a shared liability? You know, shared, I mean, in practicality, how would this work? I'm a
Sharing between the specialists and the PCPs, is what you're saying?
Well, yeah, the primary care provider.
Yeah, so there is joint liability in Washington. So if there was a treatment decision or treatment recommendation made to the patient that originated with the specialist and ultimately signed off on by the primary care doc, then and that treatment recommendation did not meet the standard of care, then I can see cause for both of them to share in that liability. Yeah. I mean, at some point, it's just appropriate for the primary care doc to do a referral. If they can't, if it's just not within their scope of expertise, it's just appropriate to refer to the specialist.
At that point, then that transfers.
They split it off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
So Adam, are there other resources that people can tap into if they wanted to learn a little bit more?
And I think the best thing to do is to have conversations with your carrier.
Okay, with the carrier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and understand their perspective on the limits and scope of the coverage that they offer, and ask a lot of questions. And we've learned a lot that way.
Great. Emily or Kathleen, any words of wisdom that you guys have learned from this?
You know, I think when I think of consults, and I think of maybe we can use stroke as a very good example. You have a stroke certified neurologist, vascular neurologist, who knows what they're doing, what they're looking for. At the end of the day, he says, "This is my suggestion," and the ED doc is the one that gives drug right? And they're the ones that are gonna make that moving forward. So that is the consult, really. And, you know, and they also make a note that this is done via XXS, you know, so there's really clear, clear guidelines about what you can say, whose job is what, and then the delineation between the two. I think it's different than a phone call to my friend Joe.
Yeah, I would echo that, because you're right, this last bullet of the treating physician remaining in control of the care, we do write very clearly out in the roles and responsibilities in that contract with the remote site or the originating site hospital. Yeah.
Especially as we're looking at narcotics and we're looking at, you know, having to have a signed copy of a narcotic to go, and really it's a physician at the end of the day who is prescribing, who has to have that responsibility for everything.
Yeah, and then I had a side comment earlier where, you know, we are in talks with our broker currently, and no firm decisions yet, but one of the things our lawyers has advised us to look at is the technology errors and omissions coverage to cover any errors that occur because the technology glitches, in addition to the professional.
So this is like a clause that you included in the contract.
It'll be additional coverage.
Additional coverage
separately. Right, yeah, so I haven't seen quotes, and we're just basically in the very early scoping phases. Right.
That's good to know. Interesting.
No, I'm just commenting.
That sounds really helpful. I mean, to have that. Just make sure. Are there any questions from the outside folks, from folks on the line on Zoom? Well, great, thank you very much, Madam. We'll definitely take this to heart. This is quite a lot. So I think the next thing on our agenda is to talk about Senate Bill 6399. And maybe if I can call on Professor Schmidt to give us a little bit more update on that, or can I ask Ian Goodhue also to comment on what does this mean? This was the discussion about payment parity. I know I went down and testified about this, and there's quite a bit of discussion.
I think it just opens the doors so that we can have that discussion about parity and how is it going to work like to allow a pilot program so to kind of put our toe in the water, so to speak, and see where we're going. I mean, we've got to try it, I think, to make sure it's going to work, make sure it's feasible, and especially with the parity issue. I mean, payment parity, we've got to define what are those things that we feel can be done, you know, via video, and what maybe is not the best.
Okay. So I'm just reading the summary of the bill. It says the collaborative must review the concept of telemedicine payment parity and develop recommendations on reimbursing for telemedicine at the same rate as if a provider provides services in person for diabetes, mellitus, stroke, mental health, opioid dependence, and chronic pain. So those 5 conditions. And it gets a little more granular. They said those the collaborative should include a review of various reimbursement methodologies and must consider whether and the extent to which facility fees should be reimbursed.
We're looking for some guidance.
Yeah, okay. Is there and this was due by December 1st. We have some time to develop this, but I'd like to put this on the agenda for the next meeting so we can kind of maybe chip away at some of these things. Ian, anything else that you wanted to add about that?
Well, I would share a little story about the legislative session. And Representative Schmidt will appreciate this the most in the room. So Senator Becker sponsored this legislation originally in the Senate, and at that time she called a group of us together during the Senate committee process to try to work through some of the issues. Her original bill called for a pilot program in those areas for payment parity. She had representatives from the carriers, myself, and other representatives from the providers, including the Hospital Association and the Medical Association, in the room for a couple pretty long, intense meetings where we were working through issues around. It's very similar to what you all did in January, where you were getting really, nitty gritty about the actual codes that would be used in billing, what exists now, what potentially some type of parity in payment would look like. And we had very similar discussions to what you all did, I believe it was at the January meeting, right? Where you discussed the issue of parity. But because we were in the middle of a 60-day session, you only had a limited amount of time to have those discussions. And so the conclusion that she reached, and then her colleagues in the Senate, and obviously Representative Schmick and his colleagues in the House reached was, let's have the collaborative really revisit this issue, look at it, and make some recommendations. Now that, there may be multiple recommendations, right? Not everyone may agree. So, but the legislature has really asked the collaborative to take a deep dive into this issue and come back by December and make recommendations for potential action. I would think Representative Schmick for some potential actions in the 19th session.
Well, I think that's what we're hoping for.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering if I can call out some people to help, in particular reviewing some of these various reimbursement methodologies. I'm looking to Brody and Cheryl. To just kind of, I know you guys are national firms and sometimes experience in other states, particularly in, the Hawaii and Minnesota, which do have telemedicine payment parity if your company operates in that environment. It's really helpful to know a little bit more about their experience. And then Francis, can I call on you too to give us a little bit of guidance on Molina's policy for telemedicine reimbursement? Would you be willing to help us out with that?
Yes, I'm happy to help.
Okay, that'd be great. And I mean, it can be kind of a general policy. Obviously, I know that this can be a little bit proprietary, but I just would, maybe next time if we can just review. So these are some of the methodologies that have been used in other venues. That would be super helpful. Right. I mean, I don't think we need to dive too much into specific conditions, but maybe the reimbursement methodologies would be a place to start. Does that sound like a reasonable place? Good. All right.
So, Dr. Scott, if I could just add one little note, Representative Schmick will correct me if he thinks I'm wrong, but I do think, in particular, what's happening in the two states you identified is going to be of some, great important interest to our legislature. So, because obviously they're charting a course, and both the good of that and the ugly of that, I think, will be interesting to our legislators.
And I think the legislators are going to want some convincing that there is parity with that video conference versus a face-to-face. I know I'm going to have to make that case to legislators so that they're assured there's some parity with that equality of visit.
And when you mean parity, are you talking about parity in expenses or parity in clinical quality?
Clinical care. Make sure that patient is receiving the same quality of care.
With the parameters set out so that we know that within this parameter set, the patient's getting what they should be getting.
Well, if you're getting beyond what I'm saying, I'm just giving it, I'm going to have to make that case in the legislature to convince people that for these areas that the patient is receiving equivalent care.
Okay. So studies that have specifically used telemedicine in those 5 conditions.
I think that we're going to have to see some of that.
Okay. I think that's reasonable. I know stroke's been extensively studied in mental health. I mean, we've been doing it for a long, long time. Some of these others are newer conditions like opioids and something. Okay. So I also wanted to just touch a little bit on some of the other legislative action. So I understand that the collaborative was renewed. So this is we're good for another 2 years. I think that there was a request that there be a non-voting member from Labor and Industries by one of the members of the healthcare committee, and I think that was approved. And we're still just trying to figure out who that's going to be. Ian, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So that was Senator Conway had expressed that interest. He and Senator Becker had it was an informal agreement, that you, Dr. Scott, would come to the collaborative and talk about having a representative from LNI participate. And I've been in contact with Tammy Felony, my counterpart at LNI, and she's working on identifying that number. And that was, Senator Conway was very happy with that result, to amend the extension of the collaborative as a result of that agreement. The nitty gritty of legislative session. But yes, I was going to say, so the extension bill runs the collaborative through 2021.
Okay, great. The other telemedicine bill that was proposed was the ECHO specific bill that did not pass. So we got 2 out of 3 went through. So the next item on our agenda is telemedicine billing preferences. This is something that Denny had asked us to look into, and my understanding, Kathleen, is that maybe he wanted to be present for that.
He did.
So I think just as a heads up for Cheryl and Brody is that he had told me that they were in this province system, they're experiencing a high number of denials for telemedicine claims. Mark Lowe and I have kind of looked at our own internal data, and we have not been seeing that. So I think he wanted an opportunity to collect a little bit more data, and we'll do a deeper dive, and maybe Emily and Kathleen in Swedish, we can look as well.
Yeah.
But I think he didn't want to be a little premature on that. I think it's kind of his gestalt, anything else. So, and maybe we're just not billing it right. Again, forgot to put that GT modifier or whatever.
Well, and now it's the O2 on the backside,
and the
GO in
95,
the front.
Yeah, it's kind of driving us crazy.
Yes.
All these different codes. It's not gonna
I was just looking at it yesterday.
Those two.
Okay, well, great. So let's next talk about net neutrality. This is something that I was not even tracking, and Danny and Kathleen were very kind to point out that there were some changes at the federal level passed that might have some implications for telemedicine. So Kathleen very kindly agreed to kind of talk us through that. And there's a handout that she gave us. If
You
folks
have
are,
that on yours as well, can you?
do you have this one?
Yes.
So I think we may have mailed it out. It's kind of blue. It looks like this.
It looked easier to read on mine. So I apologize for the dark and the dark on the bottom, but I don't want to.
We're just pulling it up here if you want to get started.
Yeah, sure. So Denny asked if I could do a little research and play around with this as we were talking about it, and so he had gathered some information. Thank you. On right in December, right when this passed. So I'm going to kind of walk through what the previous law was, what changed, and actually you can go to that next slide. Thank you. So what is it? What changed? Why is there controversy? What are the potential impacts for healthcare? What are the newest updates? And then what is there anything we can do? What do we do next as a collaborative, or how can we look at it? So my general objective. So this was instituted in 2015, and really what it says is net neutrality is that everybody gets the same playing field. So regardless of who you are, we should all get the same speed, we should all get the same care. It shouldn't matter where we live, how much money we have, everyone should get even. It really blocked the ability to say you don't get it or you get it faster. Interestingly, there was a caveat that said healthcare is not included in that law. So it said that healthcare gets a little quicker one. So if it's telestroke, it's identified, and that was in the previous 2015 law, which I thought was interesting. So really it did have this specialized bit, but this was set as it was, and the idea was everybody should be equal, it doesn't matter where we come from. Next.
So Kathleen, just to use an analogy that maybe we're all familiar with, it's like the freeway.
Yes.
Everyone can get on the freeway. It's not because you're driving a BMW,
Yep.
you can go faster.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if you have an old car, doesn't mean you have to go in the slow lane.
And can you help clarify what the difference was for healthcare? I don't think it's-
So what they
Back
did
to
is
the
they
family
identified, we'll use stroke as a good example. They identified that in healthcare situations that they did get to go in the fast lane.
They get to go in the express lane or
Yes.
something. Okay. Yeah.
Which is interesting because it really isn't very clear to say that the rest of us all have to go at one speed. But they said,
It's
except
called a QoS, a quality of service. Yeah, and we have ability to do that here, even in our institution. It basically says, we got to tell stroke, so I'm going to kick Representative Schmick off his email, or people who are, going on Netflix or whatever. That's kind of what it does. And technically, I'm not sure how that happens, but
yeah, I know that when we did set up some of our external partner sites up on the peninsula, that it took us a little bit to get the bandwidth where it needed to be. We had to go build a cable underneath Puget Sound to get out there so we could get really good healthcare out there fast. And so it was bigger, wider cables, and we couldn't provide it until that was done. So fancy. So in December, we had a new group of the Federal Communications Commission passed from 3 to 2 to scrap it, basically, say we're not going to do that anymore. And what it did is it changed that. So it says now what we want to do is we want to restore this sort of light touch. We don't want to have Big Brother overlooking. We want to foster the growth and openness and freedom. So it sounded really nice. The rule states now that the ISPs must notify you if they've changed your rate. But it doesn't really clarify what that means. It just says they need to notify you that they have done it, not that they're going to do it, but that it's done. So there's a little bit of funny language. It's not very clear. Not a lot of you're laughing. I know that's what I was laughing at. It was sort of open.
I think your comment about it feels good to have something is very accurate.
Yes.
So how does that work in the analogy that you just, not the analogy, the example of kicking people off Netflix when bandwidth is low, or let's say you have an extra set of telestroke visits that are happening, and so it's taking a bunch of bandwidth. So people in the middle,
fair, does it?
no, it's not that. It's just for the people watching Netflix, they have to be notified at that moment that all of a sudden things are slowing down.
Nope.
they're just going to notice.
No, they're just going to notify you. So you may
After the fact.
after the fact. So
Okay,
they're not going to
so-
send you a yoo-hoo. You're slow now because this is something over here that's more important. Or Comcast or somebody else says, we'll give you X number of dollars to make sure we have the ability to always be fast. So it doesn't, there's no regulations around who has control and who doesn't. There's nothing that says that, that if you pay $6 and I pay $6, maybe you'll slip 3 under the table. Or, or we can just, if you pay this level, you can have this level service. But if you pay this level, because maybe you live in Chelan or you live in Okanagan County and you can't afford that, where does that put you? Right? I mean, it depends on how deep your pockets are or not.
So
that's
that
some of the
undid the
discussion.
healthcare exception too?
Unfortunately, it doesn't call that out. So that's one of the bad things about it. What they instead of having those rules, what they're saying is they quote unquote say that they will place a robust transparency requirement and an FTC-led consumer protection. But it doesn't really clarify what that means and how, from everything that I read from the, I don't think 75 pages of the law itself, I couldn't see where it called that out. How are you doing this? Next slide. So pros and cons. So from the folks who support this, they think it's going to increase. I'm just going to lay it on the table flat and not say I agree or disagree, because some of these things, it makes sense on both sides. So the thought behind it is that there will be an increase of innovation and investment in networks. They're going to push the envelope a little bit more. There won't be as many requirements. And they're hoping that the overall costs for consumers will be reduced. They believe that it will provide a greater connectivity in rural and underserved hospitals.
Do we know why?
everything that I read did not clearly explain why, but this is from the body of a speech that was given by the chairman without any follow-up to it. And they believe it will revitalize the energy going to those underserved areas. It'll just say, oh, we really need to put this focus here now. Again, I couldn't find any language that explained the whys and hows. I did put my references of where I found these pieces, but I wasn't able to track where they picked those pieces up for. Negatively, there is no timing for the notifications of the changes. As you said, if you're in the middle of a Netflix movie, you're not going to get a yoo-hoo, your movie's slowing down. They believe that it will potentially open the door for special deals to websites or apps. And there's a potential repeal of what we talked about before, the fast lanes for healthcare. And also, there's research that specifically says that internet capability and that it's a social determinant of healthcare, and that this is going to slow that down significantly, especially for our rural and underserved areas. So everyone gets excited on both sides about pros and cons, but there's not, what I found a lot is it could and it may, but we don't know. At the end of the day, if there's no parameters that really says what we're going to do and how we're going to monitor it, then we really don't know what's going to happen. Next slide, please. So impacts to healthcare, EHRs. We're doing a lot of cloud-based storage of EHRs. If that's going to be slowed down and you're in the middle of a stroke, that's a great example. Is that how do you access those EHRs? Remote monitoring functionality. There's a lot more apps. There's a lot more. We're doing CHF work. We're doing a lot of those different programs. How is that going to be impacted? Are they going to be slowed down? If somebody has a lot of money in apps, is that going to boost them up quicker? How will that be regulated? And telehealth in general. Telehealth is, especially in your synchronous, your in-time case, that's a really, really big bandwidth, and that takes a lot of energy. And so is that going to suck out from other places, or are we going to lose that capability to be able to provide that high level of service? Thanks, Ken. So impacts, the ISPs may be able to say, you win, you lose. We don't know what that regulation, again, this is coulds, woulds, maybes, we don't really know. This also looks at the data centers. The other interesting thing is that several ISPs either operate or have existing financial relationships with vendors. So how are you going to separate that out? How are you going to be able to say that, we've got collusion here because my benefit is your benefit, and how do you separate those two pieces? Increased costs for providers. So if you were talking about the U, if the U has this ability to, if they're going to get charged, and they're going to pass that down in other areas, right? So if we're going to get charged more because we need a better bandwidth, then it's a trickle down, right? Our providers are going to have to charge more. It all works its way down. So how do we manage that? And then the impact of both 1 and 2 to me was it's a negative impact to rural and underserved areas. When we deal with a lot of folks who are in areas where they don't have healthcare providers, they don't have the money to pay for this coverage at a higher level. So how do we manage that? Sounds like doom and gloom. Next slide, please. So in January 16th, 21 states and the District of Columbia sued the FCC to restore those. So that was what happened right after the first of the year. And on March 5th, Washington State, Governor Inslee signed the first state net neutrality bill. So that's supposed to go into effect on June 6th. The interesting piece of that is that the federal government blocks the ability for states to make that decision. So what happens there? We passed our law, but the government says you can't do that. We don't get to make our own decisions. So how is that going to move forward? We're not really sure. You probably don't. I don't know how that works. Yeah. So it's, so it is it kind of it goes back to the way it was from 2015 law, basically. But if the federal government government says we can't do that, then how do you move forward on that? Those are the newest pieces. There are, subsequently, other states have already passed as well. There were 2 or 3 other states that passed as well as Washington. Where we go from now, I guess that's our next slide, is what do we do next? I think, it's a continuation of the conversation we have with our state representatives, and what are we going to do? Is it we put up parameters? We clearly define those pieces. How do they do that? How narrow do you get? I'm not really sure. So it's it was a learning experience for me to do this research as well, but I think the impact, if it doesn't have parameters, could be pretty far reaching.
Kathleen, was there any official statement from the ATA on this?
I didn't look at that, I'll tell you, but that's a good follow-up. I'd be happy to.
It doesn't seem clear, like, what we should do. I mean, we certainly have to keep our eyes on this issue. I mean, there's the potential for some harm to access, but.
And I should have, so I'd like to go back over to the ATA and see what other comments they have as well. I'd be happy to do that and provide that information.
What are some of the other concerns or questions about this?
Yeah, it almost seems like we'd have to have these conversations with our internet service provider much ahead of time before we're launching the services, because right, other than a notification after the fact, how do we even know if we're in play to have our bandwidth used or not?
Well, and I think there's often the internet service provider can vary. So, it might be Comcast here, it might be something out in Tesla. So you have two ISPs you're talking to.
I can tell you that we're working in Cle Elum, and Cle Elum has horrendous internet. I mean, it's so slow, and the whole city, the whole town has horrible support. So what do you do for those areas? How do we get them up to where they should be so they get what they need, for their day-to-day pieces, let alone to have telehealth?
Yeah, and I mean, one thing we can do, because I know I had asked our video vendor VidYO to quantify how much data it takes for a 10-minute call to compare to other vendors. And by this point, actually, we had already implemented with them, but I just wanted to know, how is that going to have its effect on our patients, or perhaps using their mobile network and their T-Mobile data to connect to us. And I will say that I will say their estimate was a lot larger, on the tune of 400 megabytes for a 10-minute call versus about 30 that my research said that Skype uses. So I think that's one thing we can at least push our vendors on, is how do we make that connection? Because I would say I don't see a large difference in video resolution or fidelity between those two solutions. So how do we push the vendors to really be efficient with their data usage?
I hadn't thought about that, but if there's some compression technologies, or do you need 1080p, kind of resolution for a telepsychiatry? So probably not.
Well, and we just went through the same thing for the exact same area, where in stroke you want to see close up, you want to see eye pupils, you want to see etc. But if you're having a site consult, you can have a conversation. You don't need to have far in camera control. You don't need to have all these other, bells and whistles, but you just need to be able to have that conversation and engage the patient.
We had similar conversations with national telehealth vendors, and they admitted that they didn't build their software with that in mind. And so just putting pressure and putting requests for requirements for that would definitely help.
And maybe adjusting it as needed for the for the different program.
Any comments from the folks in Zoom land on the phone? Lisa, I see you're there. Lisa Roche. I don't know if you had any other comments.
Nope, no comments. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Why don't we move on to the next issue, and that's if we would like to welcome a new member. This is a gentleman who's going to be representing Virginia Mason. So Julie Stroud needed to step down, and so you should have Chad Gavelin. Is that how you say his name? Chad Gavelin's CV. So he is the current director for the Telemedicine and Stroke Center at Virginia Mason. Worked for Providence prior to that for a couple of years. Has quite a bit of QI and direct patient care representation. Is an RN who worked on the trauma intensive care unit at Harborview. So he's probably seen some crazy stuff. And I know we do have someone from Virginia Mason that they wanted to say anything more about Chad.
No, not at this time.
Right. So I personally don't know him.
I do.
You do?
I worked with him.
Yeah.
It's Swedish.
He's nice.
Yeah.
That's all I care about.
I worked with him on his stroke team, and I worked with him when he was at Issaquah, and also when he was recently with Providence, so he was working with the Telehealth.
Okay. Well, maybe we can get a motion to approve Chad. Brody, give me a second. Second. Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone not in favor? Okay, well, great. So we will welcome him to the meeting next time. We'll ask him to introduce himself and a little bit more about what he's interested in. So I want to next open it up for public comment, questions, or things that folks want to talk about in the upcoming meetings. I think we've got two. One is to fulfill the requirements of 6399, and then also circling back with Danny on some of these telemedicine billing preferences. There are other things that we want to put on the agenda for upcoming meetings. I feel like we've kind of been knocking off a lot of our checklist of things to do.
Not an agenda item, but I don't know if I missed a meeting or anything, but did we get any feedback on the submission of the summary, the annual?
Brody, I submitted that as a rough draft in December because I wanted to get in there, and then I got some edits in the early January meeting, and then I gave them a final version. And I know it's been presented to the healthcare committee. They have it. It's also on our website. I haven't heard any questions or follow-up comments. Ian, have you heard anything?
No, we were having fun for 2 months in Olympia. So I think we'll get a chance. I think members will be able to take a look at it now and digest it, and we'll get feedback. But and I think the feedback will come through Representative Smink and his colleagues who sit on the collaborative. So, but we the collaborative got some assignments from the legislature during session, which I think is the direction they'd like us to go next.
Yeah, and maybe for next meeting, we could assign homework to people who have come here, because I think in order to design what the pilot is going to look like, we really do have to figure out what would be a win on the payer side and what would be a win on the provider side to come together. Because I know one of the previous drafts of the bill, had the strong threshold, 20% cost savings in order for the parity to kick in. And from the provider side, I would say, maybe there needs to be more discussion around what that threshold would be. But I do believe there is a certain threshold of outcome on a parity pilot that payers would need to see, legislature would want to see. But we're really going to have to put our heads around that. So maybe if everyone could come just with their own thoughts about what a win in parity would look like for their organization, so we can really talk about that in some detail.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
I would, I think that's a great suggestion, and I would just say from the conversations that occurred that I described earlier, that Senator Becker was spearheading, there was a lot of, I think, still confusion. Now remember, you had myself and my fellow lobbyists in the room, so we may have added to the confusion or created the confusion. But I think it might help to revisit the billing code discussion that you were all in and see if there's a way to try to articulate that in a very in a clear, simpler format. Because and I think in particular we should look at the original telemedicine bill in 2015, where there was the bill was passed to establish not payment parity, but parity in coverage, right? Between an active telemedicine and an in-person visit. And the discussion there around distant sites and originating sites. And if you recall at the time, the originating site was defined, was not as broadly defined as it is now. Because in the 16th session, the legislature passed an expansion of that definition. So there was a lot of discussion at that time, or during these meetings between the Hospital Association representatives, myself and others, and the carriers about what was the agreement at the time regarding facility fees, and what does the facility fee mean inside of the CPT code or outside of the CPT code, and what was agreed to for purposes of that bill passing in 2015. So that's where our discussion focused a lot in those meetings, and that was when Senator Becker then decided to draft the latest version of the bill that did pass.
It's confusing.
Yes.
Representative Schmick, are there other questions you're getting from your colleagues about telemedicine that we haven't talked about, or that you think they need education or information on?
I think that this report, we're going to put together some guidance.
Yeah.
I think will be very helpful.
This is a public comment period, and I just wanted to, so I'm going to step away from my role as a technician and speak as a trained informaticist, especially in regards to net neutrality. And 3 quick points. One is, I think it's important to disambiguate the infrastructure from ISP. So I heard a little bit of conflating of those two concepts, and it's important that both of those be worked on independently. Infrastructure are the pipes. ISP is the data that runs on those pipes. And so there are access issues with both, and disambiguating those will help. The second is, I think it may be an interesting project to actually gather empirical data within the state and begin a grid of ISPs by service area that serve healthcare providers. So you begin to get some data across a map. And the reason that's important is the third point, is that it's important to establish a baseline of what available bandwidth is now, because one can't ask the question about has it gone up or down if you don't have a baseline, and ISPs are holding that very close to their chest. So those would be 3 things that I recognize.
Yeah, I mean, that was my first question, Kent, is that, it's a competitive edge to have better coverage. Do you think they're going to be able to cough that up, or going to provide that? Or they're,
I think they're very interested in fragmenting the market, right? Because if one fragments the market, then they can actually pick and choose based on what their particular revenue needs are at any given time, and you'll get kind of a basket of services. And I think that that's the direction it's going. One of the reasons why I think it'd be really interesting to establish baseline and get the ISPs in the state, get as many as we can that serve healthcare, and I'm using that term very broadly. It could be nursing homes, it could be other types of things, and maybe it could be a voluntary thing where people submit into a database that this consortium would run. I'm just brainstorming. But once we have that and have the baseline about what they're using now, what the bandwidth is, then one can make intelligent decisions around policy around where we need to go.
So, it seems like you can just do a speed test, right? At some of these healthcare facilities.
Yes and no, because there are different kinds, and this is the reason disambiguating infrastructure and ISP is important, because the pipes that serve my email don't serve the ICU, and so they're separate. And so it's important to really tease out those 2 things, but they're very related, interrelated, but they're 2 distinct pieces.
And they may have 2 different ISPs, correct?
They may,
right.
And the University of Washington may indeed, I don't know this, but they may be indeed be their own service provider. So, and there are others, don't quote me on that, but it's just those 3 things for consideration.
So is there a way to work with WISHA to get that?
Oh, I think so, yeah. I can't say that those of us who lobby in the healthcare sector were terribly engaged on the net neutrality bill. But yeah, I mean, I think WISHA has the folks that could.
Other questions or comments?
This is Mary Kemping from
Anyone on
Liberty.
the phone or on Zoom who wants to speak up? I think maybe it's Stephanie. If you could just introduce yourself.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, sorry, had to unmute myself. This is Stephanie Shushan. I'm from Community Health Plan of Washington, and I work with our mental health integration program that does consultation as well as our other telehealth strategies.
And Stephanie, did you have a question or comment?
I didn't. I was just interested in hearing about some of the net neutrality and legislative topics that you were going to be discussing. So I'm just in listen mode for today.
And I believe Mary Trump was trying to get in on the phone. I'm getting a message here. My apologies.
No, you're fine.
Oh,
Mary,
yeah,
go ahead.
well, I've missed the last few meetings, and I'm really sorry about that, because if they've been like this one, I've missed a lot. This meeting has been very informative and touched on some really meaty topics, and I appreciate that very much.
Good. Thanks for coming. And Mary, if you have other topics you'd like to discuss in the future, you can let us know now or through email to Priscilla and myself, and we're happy to put those on the agenda for the future meetings.
Well, I was very excited to hear that you're interested in having a non-voting member from our agency be part of your group.
Yeah, Mary, we're just, Ian Goodhue is just working with Elle and I to figure out who that regular person is. I don't know if you're going to rotate it, but we just want to make sure that we include you on those emails. So.
Thank you.
Well, I was just going to comment on net neutrality and how many of my folks are still on dial-up.
Yeah.
I mean, you all, I'm certain that you probably have fiber type speeds for internet. Or rural Washington, my guess in my district might have 5% have fiber and decent internet speed. So that always makes me smile when we're talking about, yes, we're going to treat everyone the same and whatnot. My folks would die to have the speeds that you are saying this is going to be our limit. So just an aside, but it's another world out in the rural areas. So that's just a comment.
Yeah, it's great to know that. Thank you. Okay, well, I want to talk about future meetings. So the next meeting we're working hard to have at Olympic Medical Center. So Scott Kennedy is one of the members of the collaborative, and we've been trying to rotate the meeting for a couple of reasons. One is that some people can't travel to all the meetings, and we're trying to bring our roadshow to their entity. And also, as you remember, sometimes when we go to folks' meeting, we like to hear a little bit about what they're doing. So this would be an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what the healthcare situation is out on the Olympic Peninsula and some of the challenges that maybe Scott and Olympic Medical Center are facing. So stay tuned on the dates. I think we're aiming roughly about 4 to 6 weeks from now. Is that right, Priscilla? And I'd like to plan 2 ahead. So I am looking for volunteers who would like to host, in that May to June window, especially if you haven't hosted already and you'd like to do so. I'm thinking Virginia Mason or Cheryl, if you, Premier, would be willing to do that. One of the things you may not be noticing today is that we do have a much more mobile kind of setup, and it would be it's a little bit easier for us to kind of go to you guys and set things up. So don't be intimidated by the technology is what I'm saying. Great. I will we'll talk to those 2 folks. Anything else for the good of the order? Okay, well, thanks, Adam. Thank you, Kathleen. We've learned a lot today. I think we'll wrap it up early because I know a lot of folks are trying to get back on the road. Our passes are not snowed in. All right, thanks, everyone.
Thanks.